Eureka!
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 Eureka! No, ecco.
Yeah, it works now. Okay, I think I will start now. So good morning and thank you everyone for joining the training today. So I'll just quickly introduce myself. I'm Harshita, I'm from LAMA, and we are one of the non-academic partners of the EUREKA project, and we are based in Italy, Florence. I welcome you all on behalf of LAMA on the second day of the training, and very happy to see everyone. I met the Italian cluster when they came for their first meeting in Florence, but yesterday I also met some students from the other cluster, and it was really interesting. And yesterday's session especially was very informative for me and interesting also to see how each cluster is working within their urban living lab, what kind of tools, methods they are using and how they're approaching their preliminary research. Really great work and great discussions yesterday. I learned a lot, to be honest. I understand that each cluster is in the stage of analyzing the context. So that is a really good basis for us to start doing what we will be doing today. So building on the understanding that each cluster has developed over the time. So today we will be focusing on theory of change and impact evaluation, the main concepts involved. I will just quickly go over through the agenda for today. So we have, today it's relatively short, we have 4 hours. So we have a morning session and an afternoon session. In the morning session, we will have a theoretical part where Mattia, my colleague, and I will give a presentation related to theory of change, the know-how of theory of change, what are the steps in building theory of change, and the key concepts in impact evaluation. And then there will be a practical fun part, let's say. There will be an exercise that you all will be doing. So we will share a theory of change canvas with each cluster. And within the context of Urban Living Lab, you will be working on a mural board. And the exercise will last around 60 minutes because we also wanted to take this training opportunity where you can advance within the context of your Urban Living Lab. So to contextualize the theory of change and to practice the tool, that is the best way. So you will be working within your context of your living lab. And we don't expect you to come up with a theory of change, but we just want you to try and test this tool within the context of the theory of change. Since we have a very tight agenda, so when you're in the breakout rooms, Mattia and I will be visiting each breakout room. So if you have questions related to the presentation or in the canvas in general, we can solve those there and we can have a discussion within each breakout rooms while you're doing your exercise. And then we have a break for about 10 minutes from 12 to 12:10. And after that, there is a Christmas lunch that will be hosted by Karim. I don't know if Karim is already here. No, I don't think so. No. So Karim will be doing some exercise. So people who would like to stay, bring their lunch during the lunchtime can stay. It's not compulsory, but I think he will be using some tools based on artificial intelligence to generate imageries, let's say. So people who would like to bring their lunch and stay during the lunchtime are most welcome to do so. And then after the lunch or the Christmas lunch, we have the afternoon session where each cluster will be presenting their work on the mural canvas they did. So just to share their reflections and how they're approaching, what are the understanding they've developed so far, and also for the other clusters to see how they're doing their work. It will be again a bit tight. We will have 4 presentations back to back, and then we have an open reflection session, which will be around 20-25 minutes, where we can discuss questions, share our observations if we have any reflections, remarks. So it will be an open session for all to have a joint discussion. And then there will be a closing ceremony, which will be around 30 or 40 minutes, and it will be hosted by Sharona. I don't think Sharona is in as well. No, Sharona
She
is
will
there.
be late.
Yes, I am.
Okay, Sharona is there. Maybe if Sharona, you'd like to say something, but
Good morning, everybody. Good to see you.
Good morning.
I just went for a walk in nature because I was really tired, so that's why I'm a little late. I apologize.
No worries.
The closing ceremony will be, of course, the evaluation. It's the evaluation. We will take about 10 to 15 minutes that you can fill in the evaluation form. It's also in the agenda, the link to the evaluation form. And I urge you to please do that, because then we can make a better program even for January. And then I will ask you to, everybody, to for some words about this 2 days, how it was for you. So thank you, Harshita, for being here.
Thank you. Okay, and maybe I will give the floor to my colleague Mattia. Maybe he can introduce himself. Mattia.
Thank you, Harshita. I am Mattia, a researcher in LAMA. As Harshita said, we are based in Florence. Some of you maybe already met our colleagues in Amsterdam during last month. And we are a non-profit enterprise working in social innovation and European projects and also urban regeneration. We are divided into different areas of specialization, like design of project implementation and also impact evaluation of project. And in the EUREKA project, we are responsible for impact evaluation. So that's it for knowing a little bit about LAMA. I will give the floor back to Harshita for our presentation on material change.
Okay. Thank you, Mattia. Okay, I think I would just like to start with the presentation. So today, the contents, we try to make it precise, so that it's not that boring, and try to make it concise, the contents, and really practical, so that it is only helpful for the canvas that you will be working on. So in the agenda today, we will look at the key concepts of theory of change, what are the main steps in building, in formulating the whole process, and then what are the key concepts of impact evaluation, what are the different approaches to evaluation, different methods, tools, and indicators that are used, and then what is the role of theory of change within impact evaluation, and then there will be a description about the exercise that you will be doing on the canvas. The learning objectives is to basically initiate critical thinking in the context of regeneration, trying to understand and outline the challenges within your urban living labs, and to understand if there are certain potential impact areas that could be identified within the context of your urban living lab, and to identify those pathways of change through the process of critical thinking. And maybe this tool might not be relevant within each context, but maybe it can give you an insight to improve or orient your existing approach to urban living lab. So first, what is theory of change? Basically, theory of change is an outcome-based approach, and it applies critical thinking to plan, design, implement, or evaluate an intervention, program, or initiative that you're doing and want to make a change within the context that you're working in. It's not a process that you do
Harshita,
alone.
you will bring this presentation also in the Aluta?
Yeah, I will upload it after today's
thank
session. You. Yeah. And it's a process that you don't do alone, like just within your team, but you really need to involve the local stakeholders or the implementers that you will be working with on the ground to understand how and why the change that you would like to see through your initiative. The diagram below shows basically the main components of theory of change, or let's say the elements. So maybe I would like to start from the resources and the activities, and then go to the outputs, outcomes, and the long-term impact. Many of you must be aware with this logical chain framework that are used in each project. So the chain from resources and activities to the impact is usually referred to as a logical framework, and it's used in almost all the projects to formulate or structure their activities. But the added value of theory of change comes when you involve the component of assumptions and strategic thinking. This we will discuss later, but I just want to give you the definition of key components. before starting to use the tool of theory of change, what is required is an in-depth understanding of the context, the challenges, situation, and the opportunities of the area. So the prerequisite to use the tool is to really have an understanding of the context. And I imagine that you already are at this stage with each urban living lab, and from the yesterday's session, it's very clear that all of you have a very good understanding already to a certain extent about your area. So this is the first requirement to use the tool. And resources basically refers to the input, the financial, human, material resources that we will be using to undertake our interventions. Then activities refers to the processes or the actions or your initiative itself. Output refers to the immediate measurable product that your actions are producing. And these two are the components that you have a control over within your whole process or the initiative. It is the direct control. They are the only two elements that you have a direct control over. And the outcomes refer to the short-term or the mid-term effects of your intervention. So this is something that you can influence over time within a short or a mid-term duration of the intervention. And the impact or the long-term goal refers to something. It basically refers to the change that you would like to see. It can be a positive, negative, it can be primary, secondary, it can be a long-term effect, it can be intentional, unintentional. So it really depends what are you contributing towards. So this, from resources to the impact, refers to the logical framework. But as I was mentioning before, theory of change is really about identifying the necessary preconditions or sufficient conditions to achieve those long-term goals. So it's just not a logical chain thinking that links resources, outputs, and outcomes, but it tries to identify the conditions or the preconditions at each step. So let's try to understand what are the two main elements. So first, I would like to start with backward mapping. So a lot of people start their logical framework from the activities to the outputs, outcome, and that's how logical frameworks works. But in theory of change, what is important is the backward mapping approach. Backward mapping approach refers to identifying the preconditions that must be in place to achieve the impact. So when you start a theory of change approach, what you do is you start from the long-term impact, and then you start going backward to the outcomes, to the outputs, to the resources and activities. So it's like a process that takes into consideration. So if you say you want to achieve certain change, then you need to understand what are the conditions necessary to achieve that change. And what comes additional to this backward mapping is an additional layer of assumptions. Assumptions basically refer to the fundamental conditions that are important for you to bring about that change. So assumptions are assumptions can be conditions that are already pre-existing. They don't have to be preconditions that you have to bring about. So it's really understanding the perspective of different local stakeholders, analyzing how from different analytical lenses, what can be achieved, what cannot be achieved. You need to understand the ideologies, beliefs, values that different people, organizations that you're working with hold. So it's really about identifying whether the assumptions that you're making in the process of achieving certain outcomes, are they valid enough? Are they true enough? So basically, assumptions are the conditions that you need to achieve the change, and backward mapping is identifying the preconditions that you will require to achieve the change. I mean, I cannot stress this enough, the assumptions and backward mapping, because these are really the key in making a theory of change a good theory of change. So the quality of your theory of change really rests on making these assumptions explicit and making your strategic thinking more transparent and realistic and valid and true. From the practical experience, it is really difficult. It's not that straightforward to understand the deeper beliefs, the values, the worldviews, and to understand the perspective of different organizations and different people that are involved in the process. But it's a time-consuming process. It takes a dialogue. It takes a lot of dialogue to challenge those assumptions and to understand the assumptions in the first place, to understand different power dynamics. But these are the things that are already present within your context, and you need to understand how they can influence your process, let's say, or your intervention, generally speaking. And I will give you certain examples when we go into detail. So maybe we can. And just the last point is theory of change is often used, I don't want to say in a wrong way, but it's often used as a fancy terminology in a lot of projects where they just try to explain the logical framework through theory of change. But it's more than that. Theory of change, you really need to make assumptions. You really need to sit down with your stakeholders. So it's an ongoing process of discussion and really thinking in theory critically what can be achieved. I will now explain the steps in building of theory of change. So as using the backward mapping approach, what is important first is the context analysis, and you all are already at this stage. Then the second option that goes parallelly is identifying the long-term impact and defining the problem statement. So within your context, you might have a lot of challenges that you've already identified. But now the key point is to think of picking or outlining a challenge and parallelly thinking the impact area. So these two goes hand in hand. And then the third step is defining the outcomes that you want to achieve through your actions, and then mapping what are the resources and activities you have at hand, and that understanding the main assumptions that you made all in each step, or also to test and verify your end hypothesis and for the whole process. So let's start with the first step. It's basically understanding the context, and these are just some basic elements that we use in the context of regeneration. For example, what is the background, what is the relevance, what is the historical significance, what is the local knowledge, demographic profile. So these are just the points that you're already working on. Understanding the political context, the governance structure, what are the key elements to spatial analysis, landmarks, functions, how people see those spaces, stakeholder mapping and analysis, who are the key stakeholders, what are the power relations, key dynamics, and what are the key needs and the barriers. And the second step to context analysis is to really synthesize your main challenges and opportunity. So it's to really put down in 1 or 2 lines, this is a key challenge, this is the key opportunity within the area, and then try to see if there are any association among these challenges and opportunities, and whether you can link these challenges and opportunities to certain stakeholders. So these are just like some guiding rules that you can apply to better understand the context. So if you can connect certain challenges and opportunities, maybe you see certain commonalities between these challenges and opportunities. It can be a stakeholder, it can be anything, it can be a reoccurring theme that you noticed. So you really need to see how these challenges and opportunities are connected, or if there is a common theme emerging out of these challenges, to better understand your context, or to understand the key causes within the problems. So moving on to the second step. The second step, so as I was saying, that you might identify a number of challenges within your urban living lab, and there might be a lot of structural challenges. There can be some minor challenges, but when you are going to outline the challenge, the key is to understand what is the most relevant challenge that you can address within the scope of your intervention. Maybe it's the timeline that you have, maybe how realistic your expectations are. Maybe you want to have, you want to address a challenge that is at the policy level. Maybe you want to undertake a research-based study. Maybe you want to undertake a challenge that is in practice. So maybe you want to undertake a micro interventions, but it's really understanding the scope of your challenge that you want to address. So it's from the list of your challenges, you need to pick the most relevant challenge that you think can be achievable, can be addressed, and it's realistic enough for you to do within the time frame you have. And determining the scope, whether you want to do it in practice or whether you want to do it at policy level. And also then understanding who can be involved in addressing the challenge. So it's about prioritizing and outlining a challenge to define a theory of change moving forward. For example, it can be anything. If somebody mentioned there is a lack of green spaces, so maybe you want to increase awareness about green practices among the local community. That's just the challenge that you want to address. So it's really understanding the scope that you want to address. Then the second point that goes parallelly when you are picking up your challenge is to identify the impact area. So what are the possible impact areas emerging from the challenge? So it's about, so when you think about the change, there are key broad dimensions that can guide you, like social, environmental, economic, cultural, health, being within urban regeneration field. So you need to attribute a broad impact dimension and then try to narrow it down and make it specific. For example, if you said that you want to increase knowledge and awareness about the green practices within the local community, then maybe it's related to promoting a good health and well-being within the area. So it has an environmental dimension, but try to make it more specific so that it refers to a change rather than just the broad impact dimension. And then the key problem, the key thing in this step is to define a problem statement. So problem statement will be basically your mission statement of whatever you are doing in the ground or in theory, let's say. So once you have identified the main challenge, try to understand what are the long-term impact or the impact dimensions associated with your challenge. What you do is you try to define a problem statement. The logical step is to state your problem, then state the main causes of the problem, and then state why that problem is important within the impact dimension that you chose.
Ashita,
Yeah.
Can I just interrupt? There's a question in the chat. If people can ask questions to make it a bit more interactive, is that okay for you?
Yeah, I think I will stop in the middle of my part when Mattia starts, and we can have the questions then.
Okay.
Yeah. So for example, here is like an hypothetical example. There is an area which has lost its historical and cultural significance over the period due to bad state of conservation of its tangible and intangible heritage. And there is a sharp decline in the activities related to tourism that is directly affecting the local economy. So maybe here the challenge in the area is that the tourism sector is being affected very badly, but the way that you have identified your problem statement is that you want to focus on the historical and cultural significance of the area, because you know you can contribute to the placemaking of the area. Maybe you cannot directly contribute to the tourism economy of the area. So it's about defining your problem statement. So here we start with the problem of there is a declining interest in the historical and cultural significance, and the impact area that you want to contribute is to the placemaking of the area. That might eventually unintentionally have an effect over the tourism in the long run, but you need to be clear about your problem statement. You're not saying that you are contributing to the local economy directly, because through placemaking, that doesn't sound realistic all the time. So it's really about iterating what is achievable and what is realistic and how you would like to define your problem statement within the context. Then once you have your problem statement and your impact area identified, the key point is to understand the outcomes. So for instance, let's say you have identified the impact area to promote healthy and sustainable lifestyles. So now here comes the role of preconditions and the assumptions that I was mentioning before. So there can be a number of outcomes associated with this particular impact dimension. For example, you can say you want to increase knowledge and awareness on that topic, you want to enhance access to open and green spaces, you want to increase motivation. But then you need to think about the assumptions in place. When you say you want to increase knowledge and awareness, then what are the assumptions? Maybe you need willingness within the local community. Is there willingness among the people for this outcome to be achieved? So you need to really think, maybe you need support from the local government to enhance access to open and green spaces. Do you have that support in place? So you need to think of these preconditions that are required. So really going from impact to outcomes, you have to think of the conditions and the preconditions that are necessary to achieve that. And it comes from the perspective of different stakeholders that are involved in the process. And the next step is the practical part. Once you say that, let's say you want to increase knowledge and awareness about green practices. So you have defined a particular outcome that you would like to achieve. And now you need to understand what are the key processes and actions that will be required to influence this identified outcome within the target groups. And here it is important to outline a particular target group. Who is your target group is very important to identify, and how the solution will be undertaken to influence the outcomes. So you have to also determine a logical sequence between the preliminary activities for undertaking a particular action. Let's say you want to increase knowledge and awareness on the green practices. Maybe you want to do a workshop on community gardens, or you want to install community gardens throughout the neighborhood. So what is the action that will translate into that outcome you think in the best possible way, and who are the target groups that you would like to influence that particular outcome for? And once you roughly have the idea, what you parallelly think is the resources, because again, this two goes hand in hand, that you need to understand what are the knowledge, skills, and the tools you'll be needing, and how you can use the existing resources that are available. So it is about really mapping the resources you have in hand. And then defining the outputs. I'm not going in detail for the output. It's just the measurable immediate product of your actions and activities, just for the purpose of accountability and keeping track of your actions. So if you're organizing a workshop on community garden, who were involved? What did the participants learn? Were there any key takeaways? So it's just a matter of understanding what were the immediate products of your intervention. But it's again, it's good to put it down, because it gives a sense of accountability to what you're doing. And the main step is verifying the assumptions. So assumptions, again, I would like to emphasize, are the necessary conditions on how the change might happen. And it's like a really check. So when you're at the end of your theory of change process, you have a whole hypothesis where you have come from, that you want to see this particular change. So if you do this particular action, then there will be a wide change that will be happening within the area. So now you have to think maybe in the reverse, then the whole hypothesis that you have made, and try to see and understand from the perspective of different local stakeholders, or stakeholders in general. So if you are an inhabitant in that particular area, will this make sense for you? Having a community workshop on community garden will make sense for you to promote, to instill a behavior of healthy practices within the community. So you have to really think from the perspective of different people or the target groups that you're involving, and it's about verifying your hypothesis. And generally there are like 4 main points in understanding your hypothesis. It's like when you're thinking from the impact to the outcome, you need to assert or clearly define what are the assertions that you're making during the process. And then what are the important preconditions that you have identified? And you need to justify those conditions from the lens of different stakeholders, and also identify maybe other factors or which are outside your influence, contextual or environmental factors. Maybe there are political factors that can hinder the pathways of change. So you need to be really realistic and transparent in identifying the assumptions that you're making. And the last step is the theory of change diagram. So this is basically the communication tool that people use for representing their theory of change. So you start with problem statement, you list your resources, and then you define the activities on how you will use these resources, what are your outputs, and what are your outcomes and impacts. So this diagram is the key communication tool of theory of change process to circulate and to see among, sorry, yeah. I think I would like to stop here, maybe. But yeah, just to emphasize just my last point, is like theory of change itself is a process and a product. So people often see it as a process, but it's also an ongoing process that should be adapted based on what is happening on the ground, and based on the ongoing discussion and analysis of the feedback that you're receiving from the stakeholders. So it's about ongoing process, and it's really about thinking in theory, critical theory, basically. So maybe if people have questions about just this theory of change part, and then we will move to impact evaluation. Yeah, please go ahead.
Hello, thank you so much. I was thinking about the first, let's say, step. So we can imagine that when defining the problem, we might have a priority or some priorities, but other stakeholders might have other priorities. And so how to deal with this conflict in the problem definition, which is such an important phase. Does the theory say something about that, or not?
I mean, it depends on really what you have under your control. So even if the interest of other stakeholders is something else, but can you really control that? So it's about being practical. It's not about fulfilling the interest of everyone, but what can be achievable. Like the expectations may be huge and large, and maybe people want to address structural problems, but do you really have the timeline? Do you really have the resources? Do you really have those practical inputs to address that particular challenge? So it's about being practical in the end. Like, it also highly depends on the context, but yeah, maybe Mattia, if you like to add something.
No, I mean, it's fine. It's fine. I completely agree with you, Arshita. Okay. Are there any other questions?
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome. Okay. Since there are no more questions, so I can start sharing my part, Arshita.
Okay.
Okay, Arshita showed you. No, sorry, but there was a question actually. I saw.
Yeah, sorry, I wanted to make a question.
Yeah.
Yeah, it just seems to me that it has to be a process that's so planned, and it has to kind of go well on the first try. But how is iteration? Is there room for iteration in theory of change too?
Yeah, I mean, it doesn't have to go right on the first iteration in the process, but if you involve the right actors in the process from the very beginning, like as Ricardo mentioned, that there might be a conflict of interest between the stakeholders, but you invite them while stating that problem and identify those assumptions and the conditions and work together from the beginning, then that problem wouldn't be there. So it's really understanding what are the key resources, actors you can influence or have a particular control over and would like to be part of the process from the beginning. And also it's, as I was saying, that it's an ongoing process. So it's not a prescribed methodology, let's say. So it's not set in stone once you have made a theory of change. You need to go revisit. Maybe there were some assumptions you missed on the way in the process. So you need to take into account, maybe modify and just maybe make a new theory of change. So it's really not a prescribed methodology. It's just thinking in theory, let's say. On the ground, it might translate to a completely different agenda, but if you're making right assumptions, understanding right preconditions, then it's usually should work in theory.
Samiha, maybe.
Thank you. Yeah, just regarding the first questions that has been asked to Arshita, I will just complement a little bit with a just simple idea that could make the context analysis a little more realistic, let's say, and not to get stakeholders, let's say, ideas against each other or something, or maybe stating a problem which can be also problematic for others on the go. So what could be done at the level of the context analysis is looking at the problem from with a big view, and what can a group working with the theory of change and making the context analysis, they could apply what we call the causal loop diagram. So thinking a little bit in terms of systems thinking, and while you do this causal loop diagram, and I can also upload something later in Aluth just to complement your presentation for this. I have something ready. They can look at all the negative impacts and positive impacts in different stakeholders while stating that problem and looking at it from different angles, which means that if you are going to apply, stating one problem and thinking about different possibilities for resolving your problem, you may be impacting negatively on others. So having the whole system in front of you, there is also a very good software that online and free and everything that could be used by our participants on the go while presenting this. It's called Vensim, and I have also a little short video on explaining how to make use of it. And then you have all the system, and it makes that step, I think, a little more realistic at this point, so you know who is impacting on who and what is impacting on what. So I'll just complement it later with you.
Perfect. Yeah, can you share the name in the chat, maybe?
Yeah.
Yes, of course, right now. And I have also a presentation that I'm making these days for a group. I will just share my presentation and share the video, because I made some videos also explaining how to use the Vensim. And there is also tutorials for this. Yeah, exactly.
Perfect.
Okay.
Thank you, Sharona.
Mattia, you would like to start?
Okay, yes, if there are no more questions, I will start with my presentation. Okay. So Arshita just showed you what actually impact is. And can you see my screen?
Yeah.
Okay. And what we would like to introduce you now is the concept and the task of impact evaluation, and starting from its own definition. Impact evaluation is the assessment, the measurement of the effect of projects and intervention. And as Rashida said before, it's about evaluating not only the expected or intended impact, but also the unexpected and unintended impact, even if they are positive or negative. And so through impact evaluation work, you can assess what are the causal contribution to the impact. So you assess the logical chains that connect your activities to the impact generated. And also one job of impact evaluation is about explaining how interventions can contribute to a final effect, and so that this can be can have a formative purpose about. So you can better understand your project, and then you can deliver better project in the future. So the primary purpose of impact evaluation, to finalize, is to determine whether a program has an impact, and more specifically to quantify, also to measure how large that impact is. Why it is important to do impact evaluation for intervention and projects? The first reason is about accountability. I mean, to understand and show how your resources are used, to show the value of your project, and to understand the overall effect of your activities, and to show them to the public. This is especially true for public bodies and public funded program or policies. And the second reason why it is important to the role of impact evaluation in program intervention, it's a formative learning purposes. I mean, impact evaluation collects evidences on your intervention, and this is important also to improve or reorient a future program, to inform different decisions about an issue, and also to decide to give tools to the decision maker to decide about continuing or interrupting a program or a policy. So the impact evaluation mostly answer four main questions. To what extent can a specific net impact be attributed to the intervention? Also, did the intervention make a real difference? How has the intervention made a difference? So it's about understanding the process and the mechanism. And will the intervention work elsewhere? This is about the formative and learning purposes, also to understand how a program and a policy can work elsewhere from your context. So one key concept of impact evaluation is about causal attribution, meaning we have during the impact evaluation work to connect cause with effects, and we have to isolate all those factors that are not related to our intervention. Meaning this is a very simple example. Our expected impact is about knowledge, increasing knowledge and awareness on green practices. So our intervention is about delivering public workshop and so on to increase this knowledge and awareness. But at the same time, there are other factors, other intervention, other policies, other groups that are already working on this topic. So the work of impact evaluation is about understanding the causal attribution of our project, meaning understand really on which area, what is to quantify what is the real attribution that it can be can be related to our intervention. And this is a very key concept of impact evaluation. And there are different design approaches that try to assess and also to determine causal attribution in impact evaluation. The most used design approaches in impact evaluation, maybe especially in local development, international development program, are experimental studies. What are experimental studies? As the name already says, it's about doing a real experiment on social issues, on real people. So the most known method, design approaches for this kind of studies, the randomized controlled trial, which is derived from clinical studies. It's about the placebo effects and testing new drugs and medicines on different groups. So it's about randomly choosing two different groups with the same characteristics. One group is the treatment group, which will receive the treatment. In this case, it will receive the intervention, the social intervention. The other group, it's the control group, which will not receive the intervention or the policy that we deliver. And then we measure the difference in two theoretically identical groups, at least for, they're not identical because they are real people, they may not be the same characteristics at all. So, and then we analyze the difference between the treatment group and the control group, and we understand, so what is the impact of our intervention. Then there are also other statistical model for design approaches, like longitudinal studies, or also applying econometrics to impact evaluation. This kind of studies received quite some critics, because sometimes also they usually answer to small questions, meaning they answer to impact questions with just numbers, and they don't explain how and why the impact is generated. That's why also other design approaches are often used in impact evaluation. So the first kind is about theory-based design approach. Theory change is one of them. It is an approach that is focused on mechanism and the process that delivers the change. So the causal attribution, as we will see, is based on the process chain, the logic chain. Also, there are case-based design approaches like ethnography, which go in deep in understanding the situation or the context of the intervention and the reason of the impact, and also to quantify the impact through a case-based approach. And then participatory approaches, meaning involving the stakeholders and especially the beneficiaries in understanding, for example, the most significant change, which is a qualitative and participatory approach, which go really in deep with beneficiaries to understand what is the main impact that our project has delivered. And it does it in a participatory and engaged way. So, as we said, causal attribution wants to connect cause with effect, but the different approaches do this in some different ways. For example, experimental studies, as I said before, they do this without providing information to what happens during the process. So how the effect is produced, what happens in between from the start of intervention to the end of intervention. Other kinds, instead of experimental approaches, other kinds of design, like theory-based, case-based, and participatory approaches, they try to understand mechanism process that lead to this kind of impacts. So, as I said, theory change try to understand the process change, or participatory approaches tries to understand causal attribution through the validation by participants of the program itself. But how do we collect data for impact evaluation? The tools and the methods are mostly the same as in social researches. So there are quantitative tools, qualitative tools, So surveys, analysis of statistical data, and from a qualitative perspective is about doing focus group, face-to-face interviews. These are really basic examples just to let you understand. One important thing about these, about methods and tools is the relevance of combining methods and especially disciplines, because recent technologies and so on have kind of blurred the distinctions between quantitative and qualitative. We mix methods more than ever. But what is important to keep in mind is that there is a real benefit of combining different kind of techniques, if they are quantitative, if they are qualitative, but also it's important to combine different disciplines. You can use quantitative techniques from economics, from clinical studies, as we see for random control trial, and then you can add and mix it with the qualitative techniques from history, sociology, and so doing an ethnography and so on. Because different techniques have different aims, different objectives. So there are the ones that measure the impact, and there are the other one that tries to explain with in-depth analysis. So it is important to keep in mind this concept. Then you have after you've chosen your quantitative or qualitative methods to collect data, you have to choose your own indicators to determine the impact and your data sources, which can be primary, like you go on the field to collect your own data, or secondary, meaning you extract your data from official data sources that can be like Statistical Bureau office statistics. So, and another very important thing is about the timing of the impact evaluation. As we saw before, the impact evaluation aim to measure what happens at the end of the intervention. But first of all, it is important to understand what is the context at the very beginning, before starting the intervention. So it's fundamental to do a baseline analysis, meaning at the beginning, before your project starts, and to collect all the relevant information at the beginning, and then to measure it or during the process. And for sure, you measure it after the project is finished, so that you have a full understanding of the impact of your projects. So just to finish, yes, I have 5 minutes left. So why we think that the theory of change is important for impact evaluation? The question is that at the heart of impact evaluation, there is a strong need to link causes and effects. So, and to explain also how and why, not just to measure. And this highlights how the theory in impact evaluation is so important, because a theory of change approach can make the planning, the implementation of a program more clear. It can sharpen the planning and implementation. And so stakeholders will have clearly in mind their outcomes, the activities that need to be implemented in order to achieve those outcomes, and also the context factor that surround all the initiative. Also, with the theory of change, the measurement and collecting the data for your impact evaluation will be facilitated. Why? Because an evaluation based on a theory of change identifies what to measure, identifies the outcomes and implementation activities that are intended to achieve this kind of outcomes. So it helps to guide choices also about when and how to measure those elements. So when articulating a theory of change at the beginning and gaining also an agreement by all stakeholders and beneficiaries helps in reducing problem associated with causal attribution of impact. It does not eliminate this problem, because theory of change cannot stand alone in an impact evaluation, and we will see in a few moments. But this helps like strengthen the logic chain of of the process by an agreement from all stakeholders and beneficiaries. So, and also it is important to involve beneficiaries from a theory of change point of view. But maybe its most important contribution to the evaluation, it's the understanding of how and why we produce the effects that we collect. So this is, as we saw before, this is not an issue that is addressed by experimental and statistical studies, which most of the time focus only on the measurement and understand what happened and understand the measure of what happened. So theory of change gives another perspective, which is more, as I said, process and mechanism based. The last thing, as I said before, it is important to remember that theory of change is just an approach, only one approach possible, and it provides like a framework for evaluation of complex initiative that it can be useful to the evaluator and also to other stakeholders. But of course, you will have to employ all the other methodological tools to collect data. You will have to integrate theory of change with other kind of design approaches to get a complete and full understanding of your impact.
EUREKA.
Eureka!
EUREKA.
Eureka!
Eureka!
EUREKA.
Eureka!
EUREKA. EUREKA.
Eureka!